It's one of the scariest and most analyzed films of all time, and for good reason. Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film, The Shining, seems to tell a simple story. A struggling writer named Jack Torrance takes a job as the caretaker of the isolated Overlook Hotel, a place which turns out not only to be haunted, but to be conscious and capable of preying upon people even from within their own minds. Jack, together with his wife and son, are harried, tormented, and tempted by the Overlook in horrific ways, which ultimately end in tragedy, or so it seems. This simple story is sprinkled with so many mysteries, ambiguities, and seemingly outright contradictions that we are not only terrified, since there is nothing more terrifying than a malevolence which we cannot completely comprehend, but we keep going back again and again, not just to breathe again The Shining's misty air, but to try and find some answers. It's almost like The Shining takes possession of the people who watch it, drawing them in to stay forever and ever. Well, at least that's true for some of us. In the decades since its release, analyzers from all walks of life have speculated on what The Shining really means, trying to explain the unexplained, formulating theories which range from social commentary to outright secret messages encoded into the celluloid. Does The Shining contain subliminal messages about jet-setting celebrities and atrocities committed against Native Americans? Or perhaps messages about the gold standard, or even about the moon landing? Most of us come away with a feeling that the interior of this isolated hotel is larger than the world itself. We feel like we are confronted with the incalculable complexities of humanity at every stage of life, from childhood to parenthood, the lower classes to the upper classes, echoes of social conflicts, and snapshots of history. This film is like sensory overload. It's disorienting. So disorienting that we don't even notice that the confusion we feel might be the gentle slipping of a dissipating mind. We lose the ability to see, not just when our eyes fail, but when there is so much to see that we cannot possibly see everything, or bring the whole into focus. A man goes insane not when he loses the ability to think, but when he thinks without restriction. The Shining puts us, the audience, into the point of view of this little family that is quietly going insane together, which makes The Shining one of Kubrick's most enduringly relevant films. If there's anything that strikes closer to home than the family, it's the workings of our own minds. The more we come to appreciate how The Shining is able to sketch largely the human soul, painting the problems of addiction and substance abuse, reason and cognition, values and morality, all against the expanding patterns of environment and history, and even the supernatural itself, we may find that the most uncomfortable thing of all is that we see ourselves looking back in the mirrors of The Shining, standing at a crossroads where every human heart contains everything that came before it and everything that will come after. A great film will often tell you everything that's going to happen in it in the very first scene. And The Shining does this in a really profound way, both implicitly and explicitly. The first thing that Kubrick shows us is a shot of mountains and a minuscule car driving through them, small and insignificant against a vast wilderness. In contrast to the opening credits of a film like Barry Lyndon, which hastily introduces the director and the two starring actors before beginning, the titles of The Shining go on and on for almost 3 minutes. It's like we are traveling far from civilization into the proverbial heart of darkness, where society's laws, customs, and protections do not obtain, and its conventions will be challenged. We are going to the Overlook Hotel, where we will be introduced to the central character of the film, Jack Torrance. who has come to the hotel to interview for a job as the winter caretaker. But before the interview begins, the scene is awkwardly interrupted in order to take us away from the Overlook and introduce us to Jack's family, who are back in an apartment in Boulder, Colorado. Jack's son Danny and his wife Wendy play an equally central role in this story, but the family is not introduced together with each other, but apart, as if they are separated by a great rift, which spans mountains and lakes. The literal distance between Jack and his family tells us that there is also a relational distance between these characters. In contrast to his father, we learn that Danny does not want to go to the Overlook, though he doesn't explain why. We cut back to Jack's interview, where the hotel's manager, Stuart Ullman, is telling Jack about the job, explaining that he and his family will be alone for several months. Oh, and by the way, one of the previous caretakers ended the life of his wife and daughters during one of the previous winter seasons, which just goes to show how dangerous prolonged isolation can be, and how it can take a severe toll on the human psyche. The fact that Ullman feels the need to tell Jack about this horrific crime is not just a warning about the potential danger of cabin fever, but it also reflects the fact that many people are uncomfortable with staying in the same physical location where something horrible happened in the past.
Well, obviously, some people can be put off by the idea of staying alone in a place where something like that actually happened.
It's almost as if things that happened in the past leave a trace of themselves behind. This, of course, is where The Shining has the boldness to tell us explicitly what is going to happen in this story. Though things might not turn out exactly the same way, it seems that Jack Torrance is in danger of repeating the actions of Charles Grady. And this idea is only reinforced by the next scene, where Danny is talking to his imaginary friend, Tony, who just so happens to know that Jack has already been hired at the Overlook, and he tells Danny that Jack is going to phone up Wendy to tell her about the job in a few minutes. Apparently, this imaginary friend can accurately predict the future, which is important to know because when Danny asks why Tony doesn't want to go to the Overlook, Tony responds by giving Danny a vision of a literal bloodbath happening at the hotel. This seems to be a kind of prophetic vision, a symbol of what is going to happen, although the fact that Danny also sees an image of two girls who remind us of the two girls Ullman just told Jack about seems to blur the line between what has happened and what will happen. Is Danny seeing the future or the past? Since this horrific vision gives Danny a kind of seizure, Wendy calls a doctor to come check up on him, and the doctor concludes that there is nothing physically wrong with Danny. But obviously concerned about Danny's episodes, the doctor asks Wendy about Danny's history, and Wendy tells the doctor that Danny's episodes began when Jack dislocated Danny's shoulder one night after he had been drinking, which does not look great for Jack, but Wendy runs defense for Jack like a first-round draft pick, saying that it was just an accident, and it ultimately led Jack to give up drinking. Still, the future doesn't look very bright for this little family. When Wendy and Danny join Jack at the Overlook, they are given a tour of the premises, which serves to introduce most of the key locations in the film: the Colorado Lounge, their private apartment, the hedge maze, the gold room. Although, for some reason, Jack and Wendy just leave Danny alone in the game room, where he sees the two girls from Tony's vision. When Danny is reunited with his parents for the tour of the kitchen, the Overlook's head chef, Dick Halloran, just begins telepathically communicating with Danny, as one does. And Halloran takes Danny aside so that they can talk about this special telepathic gift called Shining, which both of them share. When Danny asks if Halloran is afraid of the Overlook, Halloran brushes it off and simply hints that, the hotel itself maybe kind of also has this telepathic shining ability, which, for the record, I would be 100% a little concerned about. According to Halloran, when bad things happen, a trace of those bad things are left behind at the Overlook. And even though there's supposedly nothing to worry about, Halloran specifically warns Danny not to go into room 237.
There ain't nothing in room 237. But you ain't got no business going in there anyway. So stay out. You understand? Stay out.
A month passes, and the three are settled into the hotel. We get a slice of life of what it's like to be the Torrance family, going about their daily activities in this new, strange environment. It's pretty typical in horror movies to establish a sense of normalcy in the first act, so that the feeling of horror is more potent when the monster or the danger or the threat finally appears and life completely changes. But I have to say, it's pretty impressive how every shot in this sequence is setting us up for a payoff later on. I mean, talk about Chekhov's big wheel, Chekhov's mirror, Chekhov's maze, Chekhov's ball. The sheer economy of The Shining's storytelling consistently amazes me. It's on Tuesday that we start to see some rising conflict. First, Danny tries to get into room 237. It's locked, but he does see a vision of the twins. But more interestingly, as Danny is trying to get into this room, his father, at the same moment, blows up at his mother for interrupting him.
Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me, and it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
This is part of an interesting parallel pattern that happens throughout The Shining, where something happens to Danny that corresponds to something that is happening to his father. The first instance of this being when Danny first saw the twin girls in the bloodbath, as Stuart Ullman was telling Jack the story about how Charles Grady offed his family. And don't worry, this is not the last time we see a mysterious connection between Jack and his son. On Thursday, Jack just seems to stare menacingly at his wife and child as they play in the snow. Not the most productive thing in the world. On Saturday, we learn that the phone lines are down because of the massive blizzard that has just blown in. But more importantly, Danny again encounters the twin girls, who this time invite him to play with them. However, Danny also sees their grotesque fate, victims of an axe, just as Stuart Ullman had described Charles Grady's crime. Of course, this is not exactly Danny's idea of a fun playdate, so he does not accept, and the twin girls just vanish. When Monday rolls around, we see that over the past week, Jack's mind has deteriorated quite a bit. He spends all day writing, and he hardly ever sleeps. For some reason, he repeats the same words that the twins had said to Danny.
I wish we could stay here forever, ever.
Wednesday is the day that things really fall apart. On Wednesday, Danny finally goes into room 237. The ball that his father had been throwing around the hotel is rolled to Danny, seemingly out of nowhere. Although, when Danny looks up, he sees that the door of room 237 has been opened, and he goes in, looking for his mother. Though we don't see what happens to Danny in room 237, we do cut to Jack, who at this moment is having a nightmare, dreaming that he is reliving the horrors which took place at the hotel before, and that he himself is the one committing the crime.
My God, I must be losing my mind.
As Jack is trying to collect himself, Danny comes into the Colorado Lounge, and he seems to be in a state of shock, or at least unable to speak. And when Wendy goes to him, she finds signs of physical violence on him. And interestingly, her first intuition is to immediately blame Jack.
You did this to him, didn't you?
For me, this moment is so effective. In one line, it establishes Jack as a credible threat, an idea which has been simmering in the background of the film since the beginning. But this moment reveals that deep down, Wendy doesn't think Jack has changed. She thinks that Jack is capable of violence in some respect. But at the same time, this line makes us say, no, there's another danger in the hotel, a danger that you're not aware of yet. Because apparently, the Overlook is capable of physically harming someone, though neither Wendy or Jack realize it. But of course, the fact that Danny was hurt off-screen forces us to see things from Wendy or Jack's point of view, which is to say, like them, we don't really know what's going on, at least not in this moment. While it is true that up to this point we have had some insight into Danny's perspective, and we've had the warnings that Dick Halloran and Tony have given to Danny, these have also been the perspective of a child who is perhaps not capable of understanding evil, and certainly not capable of understanding the things that have happened to him. Not only is this scene able to build conflict in multiple directions in just the span of a couple minutes, and not only does it transport us into the mental state of these three characters, but it also acts as a fulcrum or a turning point. It's really a transitional moment in the film, where up to this point our main point of view character had been Danny, and we had never gotten into anyone else's head. Everyone else had seemed to be holding something back. Now that Danny is in a kind of unresponsive state, the film shifts point of view to Jack, and it's Jack who will take up the journey that Danny is now leaving off. Now it's Jack who will see apparitions, and it's Jack who will take us into room 237. For the time being, Jack seems to be in a daze, like he's not altogether there. He's just had this terrible dream, which clearly horrified him, but then he was just basically accused of trying to do the very thing that had shaken him to the core in his dream. Naturally, he seems pretty upset by this. He goes stewing through the hallways, finding his way to the bar in the ballroom where, significantly, he says that he would give his soul for a glass of beer. And lo and behold, we are perhaps taken by surprise when his prayer is answered. A bartender appears and pours Jack a seemingly very real glass of the devil's nectar. But even more confusing is the fact that Jack is not surprised. It's as if it's completely natural for there to be a bartender here and for the bar to be fully stocked. In fact, Jack knows the bartender's name and acts as if he's known him for a long time.
Good man. You set him up and I'll knock him back, Lloyd. One by one. White man's burden, Lloyd, my man. White man's burden.
One of the enduring mysteries of The Shining is Jack Torrance's reference to this thing called the white man's burden. What does he mean by this? Well, the white man's burden is actually a reference to a poem written by Rudyard Kipling in 1899, which argued that it is the moral duty of white Europeans to civilize the world. Specifically, Kipling was encouraging the Americans to occupy the Philippine Islands. Kipling argued that as an economically, socially, and culturally superior society, Westerners have an obligation to bring these goods to the rest of the world. In a letter to the then governor of New York, Theodore Roosevelt, Kipling argued that America has gone and stuck a pickaxe into the foundation of a rotten house. Here, Kipling seems to be referring to the initial occupation of Manila, which the US invaded during the 1898 Spanish-American War. While it wasn't America's first foreign conflict, there was still a significant portion of US citizens and politicians who opposed imperialistic expansion, not wanting to occupy further territory outside of US borders. However, such sentiments would ultimately be overruled by Congress, President McKinley, and progressive leaders like Roosevelt. the Philippines would become a U.S. territory. And it was Kipling who gave a soulful voice to their rationale. Right or wrong, America had invaded a foreign country, and now they had a duty to rebuild it. And she is morally bound to build the house over again, from the foundations, or have it fall about her ears. In these words, we can hear a warning that this duty is also a burden. According to Kipling, it involves sending your white sons into exile in order to serve the needs of other races. Quote, to seek another's profit and work another's gain, to fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. Not to rule as kings, but to labor as serfs and sweepers, to build roads and ports. Now that's all very interesting, but what does any of this have to do with The Shining or Jack Torrance? Well, I think we've already gotten some hints from the idea of menial labor and being in exile. But the part that's really important to Jack's character is stanza 5 of Kipling's poem. And interestingly, Kipling prophesies that the result of trying to develop undeveloped countries will not be gratefulness, but the hatred of those that the white man has tried to help. Quote, take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, and the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humor, ah, slowly toward the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? This is particularly relevant to Jack's character. Remember in that previous scene, when Jack had just woken up from a nightmare to find that someone had seriously harmed his son, and immediately his wife blamed him for it, and then ran off. The 5th stanza is perfectly indicative of Jack's frame of mind. He is being blamed by people he feels superior to, whom he is also supporting financially, at least on paper. It's no coincidence that just before Jack's nightmare, we see that Wendy is the one who is doing all of his tasks, like checking the boilers. It becomes clear, especially in later scenes, that Jack is a very self-righteous and delusional man. He sees himself as supporting his family and carrying a burden. Although in a certain sense it is true that Jack has never been able to rule as a king. Instead, he has always done what he considers to be menial labor, like teaching school, or shoveling driveways, or working in a car wash, all just to support his family. And come to think of it, there are actually some interesting similarities between Jack Torrance and Walter White. Although Jack is not actually a genius in the way that Walter is, the very fact that Jack is familiar with Kipling tells us that he is educated both in literature and in history. Neither of these men ever achieved the success they believed that their intelligence merits. Both men become very bitter, and their bitterness and victim mentality lead them to become villains. We can speculate that Jack's misery in doing work that he hated is what led him to start drinking, seeking another's profit and working another's gain, seeing himself in a kind of exile to serve another's needs. If he didn't have a family, he wouldn't have to do all of this menial work in order to support them. He could live his dream of being a writer, but since he couldn't, he turned to the dopaminergic lightning storm of alcohol in order to cope with the life he felt miserable and trapped in. However, on that night when Jack had been drinking and came home and dislocated Danny's shoulder, and just because Danny had scattered Jack's work papers all over the place, that alcohol, instead of consoling Jack, served rather to bring out the ugly truth, which had slowly been growing inside of him. In vino veritas. Just look at the change which comes over Jack whenever he takes a drink of the Overlook's bourbon. We see a completely different side of him, one which came out only briefly back when he had exploded at Wendy. Since alcohol sedates activity in the forebrain, which lowers a person's inhibitions, alcohol brings out the parts of you that you normally hide or suppress when sober. We can see that Jack is a deeply angry man, bitter at his wife and son. As Kubrick says, he is bitter about his failure as a writer and married to a woman for whom he has only contempt. He hates his son. Jack feels like he cannot escape his past. Specifically, he cannot get away from what he did to Danny. It's as if the past is eternal, as if that act of violence has left a part of itself that goes on forever. Wendy, for one, will not let him forget it.
As long as I live, she'll never let me forget what happened.
Jack tries to justify himself, saying that it wasn't even really his fault. It was Danny who threw his papers all over the place, causing Jack to have a momentary loss of muscular coordination. And besides, it was unintentional. It was just an accident. Though interestingly, Jack does not acknowledge the fact that he was likely drunk at the time. There was an external force working on his mind, but he either doesn't acknowledge it or even realize it. I have no doubt that Rudyard Kipling had the best of intentions for the world. For Kipling, empire was a humanitarian project, where the goal was to introduce a, quote, sane and orderly administration to the dark places of the earth. All of this was in the name of economic progress, an ideal which tended to overlook the possibility, indeed perhaps the inevitability, of exploitation, incompetence, corruption, and conflict of interest between colonizer and colonized, between state and people. Although Kipling does seem to acknowledge that whoever the white man helps will inevitably become the white man's captive. Dependence on any state is captivity to that state. And furthermore, Kipling's humanitarianism doesn't stop him from calling undeveloped peoples half devil and half child, which is just a reflection of the social Darwinism of his time. No doubt it is true that there are people in the world who are half devil, and there are people who are childish. But if entire people groups are viewed through these two lenses, then these two lenses become licenses for enslavement. Devils should be punished. Children should be restricted by rule. And despite the altruistic goals of many imperialists, colonization all too often resulted in atrocities. A fact pointed out by many anti-imperialists of Kipling's own time, including Mark Twain. When it comes back to Jack Torrance, we already know that he has gone too far in quote-unquote disciplining his son. And going forward, we'll find that one man's abuse is another man's discipline. And Jack Torrance will be all too willing to commit atrocities in the name of correcting people who need to be corrected. Alas and alas, how easily the best of us are lighted down to evil by the gleam of a woman's eyes. Jack's self-justifying tirade is interrupted when Wendy comes looking for him at the bar. She finds him alone, no drink, no bartender, and tells him that actually, Danny says it was some woman in the hotel who tried to hurt him. Jack's response is, interesting.
Are you out of your mind?
Jack seems to be caught between two completely different realities. One where he is completely alone at the Overlook with his family, and another where it is normal to encounter other people. Notwithstanding his incredulity, Jack gives in to Wendy's pleadings and investigates room 237. It's a terrifying moment the first time you watch the film. The camera takes on Jack's point of view, just as it had when Danny entered room 237, and the camera slowly meanders to the bathroom. The sound of the heartbeat over the soundtrack is agonizing, and we're just waiting for something to come into view, something horrifying. True to what Wendy had said, Jack does find a woman in the bath, a young and beautiful woman. And again, you might think at this point, the logical thing would be for Jack to be concerned, if not at least a bit inquisitive, like, why is there a woman in the bath in this vacant hotel? And for a split second, Jack does seem apprehensive. But once he sees the woman, his apprehension seems to immediately give way to lust. He doesn't ask questions, just like he didn't question the appearance of Lloyd, or why Lloyd and he knew each other. In fact, Jack is down to get to know this stranger a whole lot better. But as the two embrace, Jack looks into the mirror, and she transforms into a rotting but still sentient corpse who proceeds to chase him out of the room. The scene is all the more confusing because, unlike the scene with Lloyd, there is no dialogue, no words. We have to judge what's going on solely based on the action. However, if we put aside for a moment our questions surrounding what we don't know, and we focus on what we do know, we can begin to get an idea of what's going on. When we remember that just a few moments before, the Overlook had given Jack something that he wanted, alcohol, it makes sense that it would tempt him with something else that he wants. In this case, an alternative to his wife, whom Jack had just been complaining about. And while it's tempting to think that the Overlook is trying to lure Jack in order to destroy him, as if he were walking the same path as his son, it seems rather that the Overlook's intention is not to destroy Jack, but to transform him, to put him at further odds with his family, and prime him to submit to the Overlook's bidding. What seems so nefarious about this mental manipulation is that it doesn't come about by using words or argumentation or nagging, but subliminally. By using a mind-altering attraction to a certain kind of woman, the Overlook is able to effect a micro-metanoia, a small mental shift that will have vast consequences for Jack Torrance. Think about it. Jack knows, or should know, that this is the woman who severely harmed his son with lethal intent. But instead of reacting with fear or anger or repudiation of any kind, the moment he sees her, he is attracted to the very woman who hurt his son, and he wants to become united to her. It's possible that this scene is simply revealing who Jack is, unmasking the desires he harbors deep in the darkest places of his heart. The desire not just to be free from his family, but to destroy them. However, I think the Overlook is using the force of lust to shut down a part of Jack's brain, his rational judgment, so that he implicitly begins to be attracted to the things which horrified him, without even realizing it. It's a kind of nefarious bait and switch, or rather you could say that the Overlook is enticing Jack with sexual pleasure, but subconsciously giving him more than he bargained for. A new background perspective on life, new buried desires which he has not even yet become aware of. Because in this situation, to accept one thing is inevitably to accept another, even if you're not aware of it. To desire a part is to desire the whole. To be moved by sexual attraction is to experience a holistic, if temporary, change in perception. But too often, a lasting mark is left on our values, the things that we now see as good or bad. We look at the object of desire and say, "You are altogether beautiful." We no longer see any flaw in her, no matter how good or evil she may be. Bodily attraction bleeds into soul attraction. Neuroscience tells us that during sexual arousal, the neural processes responsible for critical assessment shut down, so to speak, which is the neural basis for the idea that love is blind. In fact, the throes of erotic love, and even raw lust, can have effects on the brain similar to alcohol. Of course, the brain processes involved are multifaceted and complex, but just take one example. This article from Scientific American claims that it's actually the hormone oxytocin, nicknamed the love hormone, that can have these effects which are so similar to alcohol. Both reduce stress, anxiety, and fear, while both also increase aggression, risk-taking, and in-group bias, favoring people who are more similar to ourselves at the expense of others. A cocktail of feelings and mental postures which are crucial to Jack Torrance's final transformation. For the time being, Jack Torrance escapes this lustful entrapment. And just as Danny was able to see through the playful but deceptive invitation of the twins, Jack, through the revelation of a mirror, sees the woman for who she really is. She comes from the grave, and she leads to it. Even so, Jack seems fundamentally changed by this experience. He goes back to Wendy, and strangely, he says that he didn't see anything in room 237, reminiscent of the way that he didn't acknowledge or remember his conversation with Lloyd the bartender. Is Jack lying? Was room 237 simply a symbolic vision from Danny's perspective? Or is Jack caught between two worlds, two realities, which have no remembrance of each other? We can't be sure. In this scene, we have once again returned to Danny's point of view. We are seeing what he sees in his mind. To Danny, and to us, Jack is like an actor wearing a mask. Whether or not Jack is delusional, or whether or not he knows he is wearing a mask, or believes his mask to be his real face, it is a mask which for now we cannot see behind. But what he can see are the insinuations, the possibilities. He can see the unthinkable thing, represented symbolically by the river of blood. When Wendy suggests taking Danny to a doctor, Jack erupts, accusing her of trying to sabotage his work.
It is so typical of you to create a problem like this when I finally have a chance to accomplish something, when I am really into my work. I could really write my own ticket if I went back to Boulder now, couldn't I? Shoveling out driveways, working a car wash, and yet that appeal to you.
Jack.
Wendy, I have let you up my life so far, but I am not gonna let you this up.
This is shocking, the way Jack puts so much value on his work over the well-being of his son. And if Jack simply does not care at all that his son was seriously harmed, then what preventative is there against greater harm? When we are indifferent to violence, when we do not stop it, there is nothing else to stop violence from escalating even to absurd levels. Nothing to stop blood from being added to blood, until it becomes a river. These are the kind of symbolic images which, according to someone like Carl Jung, are formulations of unconscious thought processes and subliminal perceptions. Symbols which manifest in our dreams, our psychoses, neuroses, myths, and the various arts. And I dare say they show up in our novels and films as well. The huge masquerade of evil has thrown all ethical concepts into confusion. That evil should appear in the form of light, good deeds, historical necessity, social justice, is absolutely bewildering for one coming from the world of ethical concepts that we have received, which is the modern way of viewing ethics. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Jack storms off in a rage, returning to his happy place, the bar. Lo and behold, there is a whole party going on. Fun fact, the song that Jack hears whenever he leaves the apartment is titled Masquerade, and it's about a man at a masquerade ball dancing with a woman whose very heart is masked just like her face. Make of that what you will. When a waiter all of a sudden accidentally spills drinks on Jack, he takes Jack to the bathroom to clean him up, treating Jack with all the deference paid to the wealthy upper classes. But when Jack discovers that the waiter's name is Delbert Grady, he accuses Grady of being the very caretaker who offed his family in a previous winter season. Now obviously this does not make any sense right off the bat. First of all, Stuart Ullman clearly said that the caretaker's name was Charles Grady, but even if we may have overlooked that little detail, we do know that Charles Grady also did himself in as well. So why would Jack think that this man, who is apparently alive and well before him, is the same one that ended himself? But of course, the most confusing contradiction in this scene is that Grady responds by saying that he isn't the caretaker, but that Jack has always been the caretaker. Obviously, this doesn't make sense, because it is impossible for a person to always have been the caretaker at a hotel that was built before they were born. Jack apparently accepts this as being true. He has a new and deeper identity now, one that is beholden to the Overlook because it's as if he eternally generates from it. We see the servant become the master, as Grady informs Jack that his son, Danny, has been telepathically communicating with someone outside the hotel, trying to get help. And Grady says that Jack needs to correct Danny, the same way that Grady corrected his wife and daughters when one of them tried to burn the Overlook down. We know exactly what he means when he talks about correcting someone. In the meantime, Wendy decides to take Danny to the doctor, whether Jack goes with them or not. And this is a pretty significant moment for her character. Being willing to go out by herself, leaving her husband and driving a snowcat down a mountain on a multiple-hour journey. But it's understandable, because Danny's condition seems to have gotten much worse. In fact, he seems to have been taken over completely by his so-called imaginary friend, Tony.
Danny's not here, Mrs. Torrance.
Back downstairs, Jack is preparing to carry out his dreadful mission by sabotaging the radio so Wendy cannot call for help. I love how creepy it is that Jack doesn't just immediately try to correct his family. Instead, he just goes back to work, writing like everything is normal. It not only builds more tension, but it plays up the theme of people planning and thinking and experiencing things without telling anyone else, and people pretending to be the opposite of what they are. There's no doubt that trouble is brewing, something we know through Dick Halloran. Yet another thing I love about The Shining is how it uses Halloran not just to establish the stakes for us, but to create a visceral sense of dread and anticipation. Again, we don't know what Halloran knows, but we do know from his actions that he is willing to book a flight back to Colorado. The film puts enough confidence in its audience that it doesn't need to give us verbose exposition. Just by looking at Halloran's facial expressions and his calm questioning of the stewardess, the sense of urgency is amplified. And of course it does help that there is the thrumming of a heartbeat unrelentingly in the background. As morning dawns at the Overlook, Wendy, still not knowing how deeply Jack has been corrupted, decides to go tell Jack that she and Danny are leaving, thinking that he would just let the two of them go while he stays at the Overlook and does his work. However, Wendy finds the manuscript that Jack has been working on and discovers that it only contains a single phrase written over and over again. It is now obvious that Jack is completely insane. And what's worse, the amount of typed pages indicate that Jack has been Looney Tunes for a long time, even though from the outside, he seemed to be sane and functional. It's at this point that Jack comes out of the shadows. He confronts Wendy as she's thumbing through the pages, and when he threatens to get violent, she hits him with a baseball bat, knocking him out. She drags him to the kitchen and locks him in the larder, planning to leave him there as she takes Danny to the doctor. It's kind of interesting how Jack reverts to playing the victim, trying to manipulate Wendy into releasing him.
I think you hurt my head real bad. I'm dizzy. I need a doctor.
In the same way that the Overlook seems to paint itself as the victim as well, sanctioning the destruction of the innocent in the name of self-preservation. Wendy isn't fooled by this, but unfortunately she and Danny still cannot leave, because we now learn that Jack has also sabotaged the snowcat. Later that evening, Delbert Grady shows up and releases Jack from the larder. And this is such a significant moment for the film. Up to this point, it was not altogether clear whether the ghosts of the Overlook were actually real. The Torrances only seem to experience these apparitions when they are alone. Two people never see the same ghost at the same time. and so these apparitions lack a feeling of objectivity. There are many who have theorized that most, if not all, of the supernatural things which the Torrances experience are not supernatural at all, but hallucinations going on inside their heads.
I'm not sure that that is intended to be what a typical horror movie is, which is a realistic portrayal of supernatural spookiness. I think that what's going on in that movie is largely going on in Jack Nicholson's head.
Film critic Roger Ebert believed, quote, "The ghosts may not be present in any sense at all, except as visions experienced by Jack or Danny. The movie is not about ghosts, but about madness and the energies it sets loose in an isolated situation, primed to magnify them." While it is tempting to explain the apparitions of the Overlook as nothing more than the hallucinations of a man who is losing his mind, or of a wife and a child who are traumatized, it's this scene which, in Kubrick's own words, proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the ghosts are real. We know that Grady unlocks the door for Jack, so Grady really is the ghost of the former caretaker, and Lloyd really is, quote, "the sinister apparition of a former bartender." But this raises an interesting question. If the ghosts do have the power to manipulate objects in the world, and even to physically harm someone, then why do they try to recruit Jack Torrance to destroy his own family instead of doing it themselves? For this is what Grady now does. He insists that Jack diligently carry out his mission, and Jack, for his part, promises enthusiastic devotion.
"I fear you will have to deal with this matter in the harshest possible way, Mr. Torrance. I fear that is the only thing to do."
There's nothing I look forward to with greater pleasure, Mr. Grady.
Although it's interesting that, like crooks or politicians trying to maintain some kind of plausible deniability, both Jack and Grady communicate their meaning without actually saying explicitly what they intend to do. It's inferred. It's like a code which Danny has to translate. Back in the apartment, Danny, or you might say Tony, has become aware of Jack's intentions. But not directly. The awareness comes in the form of the word red drum, which Danny has seen before, and which he now writes on the bathroom door. It seems that Tony, the coping mechanism, knows that he needs to write this warning where Wendy can see its true meaning. She sees in the mirror what the word spells when it is seen backwards. It's a warning that Jack is on his way, and it comes none too soon. Jack arrives armed with an axe, breaking the door of the room down. Danny is able to escape through the bathroom window, but Wendy is stuck in the bathroom and is only able to escape when Jack is distracted by the arrival of Dick Halloran. Quote, "At this very point, it becomes quite clear that only an act of liberation, not instruction, can overcome stupidity. Here we must come to terms with the fact that in most cases a genuine internal liberation becomes possible only when external liberation has preceded it. Until then, we must abandon all attempts to convince the stupid person." Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Letters and Papers from Prison. In a lot of ways, Dick Halloran is The Shining's most mysterious and interesting character, at least to me. I mean, you have this man who is able to shine like Danny, which presumably means he is able to see the Overlook's horrors, those things which happened a long time ago and which have left an imprint of themselves behind, and some things which may even happen in the future. And yet he never seems to be affected by the hotel, either with attraction or revulsion, despite working and presumably living there for most months out of the year. Perhaps it goes back to the idea that the Overlook mainly preys on the isolated, and that there is strength in numbers and in good character. Halloran is the kind of man who is willing to leave his vacation in Florida, fly to Colorado, and drive up a mountain in order to save a family whom he has spoken to for maybe a couple of hours. and who are basically perfect strangers to him. In the end, he sacrifices his own life, even if he probably didn't go to the Overlook intending for his life to end. He obviously did intend to do something, though what he could have planned to do by himself is never revealed. It is true that Danny and Halloran have a kind of friendship based on their shining ability, but the fact that this fellowship would extend to risking one's life, laying one's life down for a friend, is surely a testament to something more than simple commonality. Whether or not Halloran's liberating sacrifice is ultimately pessimistic or optimistic, we are left wondering if he himself becomes a part of the Overlook, as apparently was the case with Grady's daughters, which would be a sad reward for such a sacrifice. There is no question about the truth which Halloran's demise represents. Often, salvation requires a liberation that comes from outside ourselves, as well as a sacrifice. While popular views of morality might have us determining right and wrong based on our own flourishing, goodness being defined by that which makes us happy, and that which makes us unhappy is to be avoided at all costs, which is why the topic of sacrificing yourself is placed at the fringes of our moral philosophies rather than at the crux, it does become apparent that very often, if virtue is to triumph, if the things which we call good are to be preserved, we must make a sacrifice. Sometimes the right thing, the virtuous thing, the moral thing, is to give up our own flourishing, our dreams, our self-realization, our self-actualization, to give up 10,000 things that we might have enjoyed or made if our lives had gone on, and not to do so at such moments is immorality and guilt. Of course, this is a difficult idea to stomach. In fact, it becomes literally impossible to conceive of when self-sacrifice is seen only as a decisive end, rather than as a completion or a beginning. Both Danny and Wendy would both still be trapped at the Overlook, and who knows what would happen to them, if it were not for the intervention of someone from outside, Dick Halloran. It's only because Halloran shows up when he does that Jack is distracted from Wendy, ultimately saving her life. It's only because of his snowcat that Wendy and Danny are able to leave the Overlook after Danny escapes the maze. Often the triumph of virtue and goodness require something to be given up. Sometimes that is life itself. Halloran is slain by Jack, who then proceeds to chase Danny through the hotel's hedge maze. Meanwhile, Wendy wanders through the hotel, looking for her son and encountering the ghosts of the hotel for the first time. In the maze, Danny is able to trick Jack by retracing his footsteps, and he escapes with Wendy on Halloran's snowcat as Jack is lost in the maze and eventually perishes. And I love this because one of those intangible things that makes The Shining feel so special is the fact that Danny is so much cleverer than either of his parents. It gives the story almost the feel of a myth or a fairy tale. Aside from his ability to telepathically communicate and to see the future, Danny, in a relatively non-supernatural way, has incredible discernment. He's able to see through Halloran's mask and see that Halloran is afraid of the Overlook. Danny sees through the deception of the two girls, without accepting their invitation as his father had initially accepted the woman in room 237, and Danny subconsciously picks up on a connection between the two girls and his father. His ability to outsmart his father, who theoretically should be much more intelligent than him, displays an incredible reversal. Jack has now become technically stupid, while Danny, who had previously forgotten or blocked out his father's abuse, now knows his father and his own story. He remembers where they've come from. Danny is the one who sees clearly. Quote, "To understand reality is not the same thing as to know about outward events. It is to perceive the essential nature of things. The best informed man is not necessarily the wisest. Indeed, there is a danger that precisely in the multiplicity of his knowledge, he will lose sight of what is essential. But on the other hand, knowledge of an apparently trivial detail quite often makes it possible to see into the depths of things, to recognize the significant in the factual is wisdom. Danny has this remarkable ability to see into the depths of things by drawing on apparently trivial details. Consciously or unconsciously, he uses the idea of breadcrumbs, which he had heard his mother talk about before, in order to escape the Overlook's maze.
This whole place is such an enormous maze, I feel like I'll have to leave a trail of breadcrumbs every time I come in.
If we want to try and look for a reason as to why Danny seems to be so ingenious, well, based on the information we are given, we can only look to his past trauma, which again is the very origin of his ability to shine. While modern psychology seems to treat traumas mainly as negatives, hindrances to personal flourishing, which must be healed or removed or coped with, and while popular opinion treats suffering as an evil which reduces a person to the prison-like status of a victim, the wisdom of the past has recognized that deep suffering not only strengthens a person, but may be like a window into wisdom. Suffering need not restrict life. In fact, it may be the only thing that can give form to life. Quote, "We learn that personal suffering is a more useful key, a more fruitful principle than personal happiness for exploring the meaning of the world in contemplation and action. But this perspective from below must not lead us to become advocates for those who are perpetually dissatisfied. Rather, out of a higher satisfaction, which in its essence is grounded beyond what is below and above, we do justice to life in all its dimensions, and in this way, affirm it." Obviously, we do not excuse things like violence against the innocent, but we need not mope in the suffering that results from it. We condemn abuse, but there is nothing stopping us from celebrating the pain we have suffered, if through persecution or tragedy we have gained a light for exploring the world of action. Quote, "Over and over again, when a policy of imperialistic conquest has been pursued amid contempt for law and justice and brutal mishandling of the weak, there has come a gradual turning towards rightful order and peace, and even towards the happiness of those who had been the victims of violence, a change of course which has brought with it the healing of the wounds of guilt. This does not, of course, mean that the guilt is justified, or that it is removed or forgiven. The guilt continues, but the wound which it has inflicted is healed. In the historical life of the nations, there can always only be the gradual process of healing." Danny and Wendy happily escape from the Overlook, and from Jack himself. But this is not where the film ends. Rather, the camera zooms in on a photograph in the hallway of the Overlook, where Jack Torrance is pictured with a crowd of partygoers from July 4th, 1921. And this is just the last in a long line of things that just do not make any sense. How could Jack have been photographed at a party that happened before he was even born? Some have interpreted this as Jack being entirely absorbed by the Overlook. However, Kubrick himself said that the photo suggests reincarnation, which in a way is even more horrifying. Jack Torrance is born again and again, and he always keeps coming back to the Overlook. We might hear in this a parable about addiction, or perhaps the repetitive cycle of abuse. Co-writer Diane Johnson said that there is an explanation for the photo, though it's a bit strange and paradoxical, because it's both real and unreal. The idea that Jack was always at the hotel in some earlier incarnation. Jack had somehow become the creature of the hotel through reincarnation. At the same time, we're meant to experience it in the now. There's no way of resolving that. It's meant to be magical. So there is something in the supernatural, or as Johnson says, the magical, which does not obey the laws of logic. It is a contradiction which is able to exist. Incoherence extends even to the Overlook's very architecture. The actual physical space of the hotel mimics the spiritual nature of the evil ghosts and their contradictions. Other analyzers have pointed out that there are many design aspects of the Overlook Hotel that simply do not make any rational sense. In fact, there are places which should not physically exist at all. For example, when Danny is riding his big wheel around the upper level of the hotel which surrounds the Colorado Lounge, you can see on his right hand that there is a line of several doors. But you can also see that the Colorado Lounge is just on the other side of that wall, so there's no actual space for there to be any rooms there. Either this hotel has a crap ton of closet space, or these are a series of rooms that shouldn't be able to exist, or perhaps doors which lead to nowhere. An even more striking example is the window in Stuart Ullman's office. When you compare shots from inside the hotel as well as external shots, it's pretty clear that it should not be possible for a window to be here. But there is. Another thing we learn from examining exterior shots is that it should be impossible for there to be anything like the Gold Room inside this hotel as it is presented. There's just no place for a room of this size that doesn't have any windows. It seems like the Overlook Hotel is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And things which shouldn't make sense from the outside do make sense when you're on the inside. I have to give a shout out here to Rob Ager and his YouTube channel, Collative Learning, which is where I first encountered these ideas many years ago. He was one of the first people who really sparked my interest in The Shining, and showed me just how crazy this film is. And if you want the details on the layout of the Overlook Hotel, you should watch his 2 videos on that subject. While many people have pointed out these kinds of interesting facets about The Shining, I can't say that I've seen any videos which try to identify exactly what these kinds of discrepancies might mean. Did Kubrick design the sets in this way simply out of convenience, or to get the shots that feel right? Or is it supposed to give us some kind of subliminal feeling? Or is there an even deeper meaning which has to do with the very themes which the story revolves around? A man is made incoherent, insane, specifically because he is molded to the image of an evil entity. A transformation which is accomplished with the use of verbal and categorical inconsistencies that disorient with the goal of manipulating behavior and thought processes. But incoherence is not just a mere Orwellian instrument of psychological control. Ultimately, for an entity like the Overlook, incoherent realities are ends in themselves, a way of being. Evil likes company, and if it can remold other conscious things into its own image, it will, in mirror of its psychological and even its physical nature. This is the manipulation of soul itself, a manipulation so complete that it alters the soul's reality, wins its complete enthusiastic allegiance, and co-opts it forever and ever. Things which are called evil have every appearance of genuine justice, every intoxication of pleasure, and the things which most of us would call good only make Jack Torrance feel bad. At this point, immorality can no longer be defined as that which makes a person feel bad, as Hemingway defined it, using that definition to advance bullfighting and the slaughter of bulls for sport as being not just permissible, but moral, an opinion which has certainly fallen out of favor. Indeed, history has seen many things swapped from moral to immoral and vice versa. Interesting how humans change, isn't it? And it's fascinating to see so drastic a change in a single person over so short a period of time. But of course, when evil can be redefined, when it can wear various guises, it becomes difficult to resist and difficult to fight against. Whether you are the very man who is coming to find the greatest pleasure in what once horrified you, or whether you are watching it happen to someone else, and perhaps finding yourself in a position of growing danger, like Wendy or Danny. How can you resist evil when something like this happens? Many people have believed that evil can be defined by reason, and resisted, and even defeated by the best arguments and evidence. However, time and time again, history has shown us that reason proves impotent. Reason can be cast aside when it is inconvenient, Its power of persuasion has proven to be a vehicle for multiplying differences of opinion, rather than creating an increasingly unified consensus on the truth, mainly because reason depends on a priori premises, value claims, and feelings, which prove to be as diverse and contradictory as the scope of human potential. In fact, reason becomes a tool for rationalizing evil itself, as Kubrick himself commented, saying, quote, "I think we tend to be a bit hypocritical about ourselves. We find it very easy not to see our own faults. And I don't just mean minor ones. I suspect there have been very few people who have done serious wrong who have not rationalized away what they've done, shifting the blame to those they have injured. We are capable of the greatest good and the greatest evil. And the problem is that we often can't distinguish between them when it suits our purpose." The Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer said something eerily similar. Faced with a Germany that had been overtaken by the Nazis in the 1930s and imprisoned under suspicion of a plot against Hitler, Bonhoeffer lamented, quote, "the failure of the reasonable ones. Those who think, with the best of intentions, and in their naive misreading of reality, that with a bit of reason they can patch up a structure that has come out of joint, is apparent. With their ability to see impaired, they want to do justice on every side, only to be crushed by the colliding forces without having accomplished anything at all. Disappointed that the world is so unreasonable, they see themselves condemned to unproductiveness. They withdraw in resignation or helplessly fall victim to the stronger." Dietrich Bonhoeffer, an account at the turn of the year 1942 to 1943. Whether a man accepts a line of reasoning as true or false, plausible or implausible, depends a great deal on his timbre of mind. Grady's suggestion that Jack should correct his family is perfectly reasonable if Grady's premises are accepted, and whether or not we accept them depends fundamentally on what we love, what we value, and what we feel. And this is not always a reliable guide. As Bonhoeffer goes on to say, quote, "The man of conscience has no one but himself when resisting the superior might of predicaments that demand a decision. The dimensions of the conflict wherein he must make his choices are such that, counseled and supported by nothing but his own conscience, he is torn apart. The innumerable respectable and seductive guises by which evil approaches him make his conscience fearful and unsure, until he finally settles for a salved conscience instead of a good conscience. That is, until he deceives his own conscience in order not to despair. That a bad conscience might be stronger and more wholesome than a deceived one is something that the man whose sole support is his conscience can never comprehend. Maybe we need a fixed star outside of ourselves, outside of our own feelings and rationale that can guide us in the truly right way of acting and thinking. Quote, "The reliable path of duty seems to offer the escape from the bewildering plethora of possible decisions. Here, that which has been commanded is clutched as the most certain. The responsibility for what has been commanded lies with the one giving the command, rather than the one who carries it out. However, duty is so circumscribed that there is never any room to venture that which rests wholly in one's own responsibility, the action that alone strikes at the very core of evil and can overcome it. The man of duty will in the end also have to do his duty to the devil."
And when my wife tried to prevent me from doing my duty, I corrected her.
Evil issues commands just as much as the good. The question is, do you obey the Overlook Hotel or not? Do you remain independent and act on your own responsibility, or do you assimilate? This largely depends on what a person is primally and fundamentally attracted to. Ultimately, the difference between Jack Torrance and his wife and son seems to be a matter of character. By the time Jack arrives at the Overlook, he is already a little bit like it. He has vestiges of conscience. Evil may not yet make him feel good per se, but goodness is starting to make him feel bad. To expand on a quote we cited previously, Kubrick tells us that Jack comes to the hotel psychologically prepared to do its bidding. He doesn't have much further to go for his anger and frustration to become completely uncontrollable. He is bitter about his failure as a writer, he is married to a woman for whom he has only contempt, and he hates his son. In the hotel at the mercy of its powerful evil, he is quickly ready to fulfill his dark role. The Shining is a world where like is drawn to like. The hatred which is smoldering in Jack is a fire which is borrowed from the absolute hatred of refined evil, ready to erupt, with only the addition of a little bit more fuel. Evil has a trajectory. Its nature is not to stay in one place. Quote, "Men may keep a sort of level good, but no man has ever been able to keep on one level of evil. That road goes down and down. The kind man drinks and turns cruel. The frank man kills and lies about it. Many a man I've known started like you to be an honest outlaw, a merry robber of the rich, and ended stamped into slime. G.K. Chesterton, The Flying Stars." Now here's an interesting question. Is Jack Torrance truly responsible or culpable for what he does at the end of the film? Obviously, Jack is a clear villain, but by the time he becomes homicidal, he has clearly lost his mind. If Jack is insane, how should we judge him? Is he a villain or a victim? If he goes from being a sane man in control of his faculties to being insane, does he bear any responsibility for what he does while he is insane, or perhaps even in the process of becoming insane? If there is another force acting on him to influence his actions and way of thinking, whether that's alcohol or the Overlook Hotel, to what degree is he answerable for his actions? It seems the crucial moment is never the moment of violence, but what comes before the moment of violence. What leads up to it? For every mistake or crime or sin committed in life, there is a decision beforehand that gets a person into it. There is always some choice made before the mistake, before the moment when Jack lets the foreign force into his agency, when he sells his soul for a glass of beer. Jack was already on this trajectory before the events of the film, when he came home drunk, charged with bitterness from the friction of his garbage values. A trajectory which, even then, could have been arrested and altered. But the further it goes on, the more momentum it accumulates, the more difficult it is. Danny and Wendy are not drawn to the Overlook. They are revolted by it because they have a different kind of character. Hearts molded to the shape of different feelings and values, which allow them to see the same things which Jack sees, but to see them differently. In a word, we might say that they are marked by a certain kind of innocence. Here, innocence is not a forensic sentence, declaring that someone has not committed a crime of which they have been accused. Rather, innocence is a holistic state of mind or being. It is a state of being inexperienced in evil, or of having no knowledge of it. While every parent knows that children are not angels, and they may be selfish and greedy, spiteful, and the list goes on, yet there still seems to be a limit to their proclivities. There is a difference between doing and being. And while children may do wrong things, it seems anomalous for them to be evil, persistently in their character, in the way that many adults are. Quote, "What is worse than doing evil is being evil. It is worse for a liar to tell the truth than of a lover of truth to lie. A falling away is of infinitely greater weight than a falling down. The most shining virtues of him who has fallen away are as black as night in comparison with the darkest lapses of the steadfast." Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Ethics. At least when it comes to Danny and Wendy, we see no sign of malevolence, no dark inclinations. They have a simplicity which is almost incapable of conceiving of evil. And it's also interesting how neither of them have any of the aspirations for greatness or status or art or with being rich. In a word, any of the outsized desires which plague Jack. A 5-year-old isn't frustrated that his family has screwed up his ideal life. Innocence means not even having categories for that, and therefore having no taste for villainy, either innate or acquired. There's no ambition, no pride, no vice associated with elaborate higher-order cognition, but rather a kind of contentment, a childlike lack of self-obsession. For a theologian like Bonhoeffer, the goal of ethics is actually not to determine how to discern good from evil, let alone to figure out the right answer to a trolley problem. Rather, the goal of at least Christian ethics is to return to one's origin, prior to the knowledge of good and evil, in much the same way that a child is said to have no knowledge of good or evil. Quote, "A man's own goodness is now concealed from him. It is not merely that he is no longer obliged to be the judge of his own goodness, he must no longer desire to know of it at all. Or rather, he is no longer permitted to know of it at all. And indeed, he does no longer know of it. His deed has become entirely unquestioning. He is entirely devoted to his deed and filled with it. His deed is no longer one possibility among many, but the one thing, the important thing, the will of God." Here, of course, we must keep in mind the difference between the simplicity of stupidity and the simplicity of wisdom, which is able to see into the depths of things, as we talked about before. While the kind of childlike innocence which puts a person back into union with their origin might inoculate a person against the allures of evil, making them immune to its masquerade, such innocence is of little help against the predations of evil. In other words, the power which evil uses to try and destroy the innocent if it cannot seduce them, as was presumably the case with the tragic fate of Charles Grady's daughters. They opposed the Overlook, yet still succumbed to their father. Concentrated evil is cunning and intelligent. It recruits disciples who are strong yet stupid, so that they cannot be reasoned with. The stupid person, quote, "is not independent. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with him as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. He is under a spell, blinded, misused, and abused in his very being. Having thus become a mindless tool, the stupid person will also be capable of any evil, and at the same time incapable of seeing that it is evil. This is where the danger of diabolical misuse lurks, for it is this that can once and for all destroy human beings." Innocence by itself cannot escape force of arms. It makes sense then that Jesus wisely commanded his followers to be as innocent as doves, which are symbols of peace, yet shrewd as serpents, which are symbols for deception. In The Shining, it's Danny Torrance who most embodies this idea, remaining fundamentally peaceful, yet using deception to ensure that the evil one becomes the architect of his own demise. Quote, "Our body knows things, and our brain knows things that don't have anything to do with conscious thought." Stephen King. A fractal is an extensive pattern of self-similar shapes which repeats at different scales. Things in nature like trees, mountains, seashells, and snowflakes follow fractal patterns. The rings of Saturn, crystals, grains of dust, blood vessels, heart rates, neurons, DNA. The cosmos is permeated by these patterns, if not defined by them. It's no wonder that any piece of art, or any story which tells the truth, should be permeated by repeating patterns of self-same similarities, as well as being in line with the patterns outside of it, patterns in our own real world. A historical event like the Donner Expedition, which had all the appearance of rationality, resulted in being trapped, with men stripped of the facade of rationality and morality, consuming one another and appealing to the outside world for rescue. That same pattern can be relived in a different guise, a different incarnation. The Overlook and its ghosts operate in much the same way that alcohol does, removing inhibitions, increasing suggestibility. Like addiction, the Overlook fosters dependence, cultivates denial and delusion. We could even say that the Overlook and the effect that it has on Jack is a genuine symbol for alcoholism. However, it is not a mere symbol. Within the context of the story, the Overlook is a real supernatural entity and it has real influence over Jack. It was Stephen King himself who admitted that The Shining is a story about his own alcoholism. But the interesting thing is that King says he didn't know this at the time he was writing the novel. Quote, "I was, after all, the guy who had written The Shining without even realizing, at least until that night, that I was writing about myself. The part of me that writes the stories, the deep part that knew I was an alcoholic as early as 1975 when I wrote The Shining, wouldn't accept that. Silence isn't what that part is about. It began to scream for help in the only way it knew how, through my fiction and my monsters." In the world of The Shining, things like child abuse and alcoholism are just as important as ghosts and the supernatural, because that world, like our own, is from top to bottom a descending and ascending ladder of like and unlike, simile and discord. Alcohol acting on the brain really is like a foreign force, which, rather than violating one's will, simply removes inhibitions, revealing what a man always was. The way in which the ghosts of the Overlook seem to contradict reality mirrors the way in which a man can contradict himself, claiming to love his son while calling him an SOB. The Shining is a story which layers patterns on top of each other. Supernatural experiences seem to be the symptoms of a decaying mind, uniting mental decay with the agenda of evil itself. A simple hedge maze might have, and in this case does have, metaphorical significance. The hotel doesn't simply have a maze, it is a maze, which can only be escaped if you remember where you come from. Junctions which promise to lead somewhere but terminate in a dead end are reminiscent of the disorienting relationship between an abusive father and a traumatized son. It is a fundamentally incoherent relationship, rife with contradictions. The Overlook Hotel is permeated by impossibilities and contradictions. Impossibilities which nevertheless exist, and people are able to exist and function within these impossibilities, just as the final photo of Jack Torrance can be both real and unreal simultaneously. Whether the patterns of The Shining were concisely sewn into the fabric of the story with conscious intention, or whether they unintentionally fell into place simply from coincidence or a commitment to being honest about how life works, as seemed to be the case with Stephen King, the patterns are there, and they matter. Rather than being insufficient to capture the truth, language, logos, signs and symbols are in fact so deeply objective, so outside the control and total comprehension of any one subjective person, so independent of us and immovable, that to speak of one thing may be to speak of another. Language cannot be invented without tapping into pre-existing patterns. Symbols, actions, and Aristotelian imitations of fictional stories genuinely can and should, as Aristotle argued, address universals, or kathalu men, holistic truths, things that we can reliably predict will happen in a given circumstance, patterns that are true of all of life. Thus, a piece of art like The Shining can speak genuinely to many things. In our storytelling or our analysis, we may speak well or poorly. No story is a perfect pattern of reality, and when we as the audience try to discern whether these patterns are there or not, our conjectures may be more or less valid, and they may at times be false. At other times, we may grope nearer to the truth. In any case, one thing has emerged that seems certain. In the common life of human beings, there are laws that are stronger than everything that believes it can supersede them. and that it is therefore not only wrong, but unwise to disregard these laws. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Letters and Papers from Prison.